Sarah Martinez wiped the grease from her hands with an old rag that had seen better days. The Apache helicopter in front of her was a beautiful machine, even covered in desert dust and battle scars. She had been working on these aircraft for 3 years now, but everyone still saw her as just another mechanic. Not the mechanic who could fix anything that flew, not the woman who understood these machines better than most pilots understood their own cars. Just a mechanic. The morning sun beat down on the airfield at Fort Rucker, Alabama. Sarah squinted against the glare as she checked her work one more time. The Apache's engine was purring like a satisfied cat, exactly the way it should sound. She had spent the entire night replacing a faulty transmission component that 3 other mechanics had declared unfixable. But Sarah never accepted that word. Unfixable was just another way of saying you hadn't tried hard enough. "Hey, Martinez!" Chief Warrant Officer Jim Davidson called out from across the hangar. "You done playing with that bird yet? We got real work to do." Sarah bristled at the dismissive tone, but kept her voice level. "She's ready to fly, Chief. Better than new, actually." Davidson walked over, his boots clanking on the concrete floor. He was a decent pilot, Sarah knew, but he had the attitude that came with thinking mechanics were somehow less important than the people who flew the machines. "Better than new, huh? Big words from someone who never left the ground." "I know these helicopters inside and out," Sarah replied, closing the engine compartment with practiced efficiency. "Every bolt, every wire, every system. I could probably fly one better than most of your pilots." The words hung in the air for a moment. Davidson laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "Right. And I could probably rebuild an engine with my eyes closed. Stick to what you know, Martinez. Leave the flying to the real aviators." Sarah felt her face flush, but she bit back her response. She had learned long ago that arguing with men like Davidson was pointless. They had made up their minds about what she could and couldn't do before she ever opened her mouth. But deep down, she knew she was right. She had studied every manual, watched every training video, and spent countless hours in the simulator when no one was looking. She understood flight dynamics, weapon systems, and tactical maneuvers better than some of the pilots she worked with. The truth was, Sarah had wanted to be a pilot since she was 12 years old. She had grown up in a small town in Texas, the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Joining the Army had been her ticket out, her chance to do something meaningful with her life. But when she enlisted, her recruiter had steered her toward mechanical training instead of flight school. "You're smart, Martinez," he had said. "Really smart. But flight school is competitive, and they're looking for officers mostly. You could do great things as a mechanic. These new helicopters need people who really understand technology." So Sarah had become a mechanic, and she was good at it. Better than good. She had a gift for understanding how complex machines worked, for hearing problems in an engine that other people missed, for fixing things that shouldn't be fixable. But every day, she watched pilots who didn't know a rotor blade from a tail boom climb into aircraft she had lovingly maintained, and she wondered what it would feel like to be the one in control. The Apache she was working on belonged to Captain Lisa Chen, one of the few female pilots on base. Chen was professional and respectful, unlike some of the other aviators. She always thanked Sarah for her work and actually listened when Sarah pointed out potential problems. But even Chen saw Sarah as support personnel, not as someone who might have her own dreams of flight. "Martinez, you did great work on the hydraulics last week," Chen said as she approached for her pre-flight inspection. "That was a tricky problem." "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah replied. "She should fly smooth as silk now." Chen nodded and began her walk-around inspection. Sarah watched her check each system, noting how thoroughly the pilot examined every detail. It was exactly what Sarah would have done. In fact, Sarah often caught things that pilots missed during their inspections, small issues that could become big problems in the air. As Chen climbed into the cockpit, Sarah felt that familiar pang of longing. The pilot's seat was only a few feet away, but it might as well have been on another planet. Sarah had never even sat in it, despite spending hundreds of hours working around it. It seemed too presumptuous, too much like crossing a line that wasn't meant to be crossed. The Apache's rotors began to spin, slowly at first, then faster until they became a blur. The sound was thunderous, a deep rhythmic beating that Sarah felt in her chest. She stepped back as the helicopter lifted off, watching it rise into the blue Alabama sky with a grace that seemed to defy its bulk and complexity. Captain Chen was a skilled pilot. Sarah could tell by the smoothness of the takeoff, the way the aircraft responded precisely to her inputs. But as Sarah watched the Apache disappear into the distance, she couldn't shake the feeling that she could do that too. She had studied the flight manuals until she had them memorized. She knew the performance characteristics, the emergency procedures, the weapons systems. She had even built a makeshift simulator in her off-base apartment using computer parts and helicopter components that were being thrown away. It wasn't official training, but it had taught her things about flight dynamics that some pilots never learned. The rest of the day passed in the familiar rhythm of maintenance work. Sarah replaced worn parts, ran diagnostic tests, and solved problems that stumped other mechanics. She worked on 4 different aircraft, each one presenting its own unique challenges. By evening, her hands were black with grease, and her back ached from crawling around in tight spaces, but she felt satisfied. Every helicopter she touched flew better than it had before. As she was cleaning up her tools, Sarah heard voices from the pilot ready room. The door was partly open, and she could make out the conversation inside. "I'm telling you, these mechanics don't understand what we need up there," one pilot was saying. "They fix problems that aren't problems and miss things that could get us killed." "Come on, Johnson," another voice replied. "Some of these guys know their stuff." "Guys, maybe, but that Martinez girl? She's always trying to tell me how to do my job, like she knows anything about flying." Sarah's hands clenched around the wrench she was holding. Johnson was a mediocre pilot at best, someone who got by on attitude rather than skill. She had saved his bacon more than once by catching problems he had missed during his pre-flight inspections. But in his mind, apparently, she was just an uppity mechanic who didn't know her place. "Actually," said a third voice that Sarah recognized as Captain Chen, "Martinez is probably the best mechanic we have. She's caught problems that could have been serious." "Whatever," Johnson replied. "Just because she can turn a wrench doesn't mean she understands aviation. These are complex machines. You need real training to understand how they work." Real training. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. She had more training on Apache systems than most of the pilots. She had studied every technical manual, attended every available maintenance course, and spent her own time learning about aerodynamics and flight systems. But because she wore mechanics coveralls instead of a flight suit, her knowledge somehow didn't count. That night, Sarah sat in her small apartment, staring at her homemade flight simulator. It was crude compared to the real thing, just a collection of computer monitors and helicopter controls she had rescued from the scrap heap. But it worked. She had programmed it with real flight data, real emergency scenarios, real combat situations. And she had spent hundreds of hours practicing on it, learning to fly the Apache in ways that no actual pilot ever would. She climbed into the simulator and powered it up. The screens came to life, showing a virtual cockpit that was remarkably similar to the real thing. Sarah had spent months getting every detail right, from the placement of the controls to the behavior of the aircraft in different flight conditions. She started the virtual engines and felt the familiar thrill as the simulated helicopter responded to her inputs. For the next 2 hours, Sarah flew through virtual missions. She practiced basic flight maneuvers, advanced combat techniques, emergency procedures. The simulator threw every challenge at her that a real pilot might face, and she met each one with growing confidence. In this virtual world, she wasn't just a mechanic. She was a pilot, and a good one. But when she powered down the simulator and returned to reality, she was still Sarah Martinez, the mechanic who fixed other people's dreams. She looked at her grease-stained hands and wondered if she would ever get the chance to prove what she could really do. The Army had invested years of training in her as a mechanic, and they weren't likely to let her change careers now. Pilots were officers mostly, with college degrees and expensive training. Mechanics were enlisted personnel who kept the machinery running. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Admiral Rebecca Sullivan was coming to Fort Rucker for an inspection and demonstration. Sullivan was a legend in naval aviation, one of the first women to command a carrier battle group. She was known for her sharp mind, her no-nonsense attitude, and her ability to see potential in unexpected places. The entire base was buzzing with nervous energy as they prepared for her visit. Sarah threw herself into her work with even more intensity than usual. Every helicopter had to be perfect. Every system had to run flawlessly. She worked late into the night, double-checking everything, making sure that no aircraft would embarrass the base during the Admiral's visit. It was her contribution to the effort, even if she would never be anywhere near the demonstration flights. The day of the visit dawned clear and hot. Sarah was in the hangar early, making final checks on the aircraft that would be used in the demonstration. She had barely slept, but she felt energized. This was her chance to show what she could do, even if it was only through the performance of the machines she maintained. Admiral Sullivan arrived in a convoy of black SUVs, accompanied by a small army of aides and security personnel. She was smaller than Sarah had expected, but there was an unmistakable presence about her. When she spoke, people listened. When she asked questions, they scrambled to provide answers. The base commander, Colonel Richards, led the Admiral on a tour of the facilities. Sarah watched from a distance as they moved through the hangar, examining aircraft and talking to pilots. She felt invisible, just another piece of equipment in the background. But then something unexpected happened. Admiral Sullivan stopped in front of the Apache that Sarah had been working on and asked a detailed technical question about the aircraft's avionics system. Colonel Richards looked uncomfortable, clearly out of his depth with the technical details. "Perhaps we should ask one of our pilots," he suggested. "Actually," Sullivan replied, "I'd prefer to talk to whoever maintains this aircraft. Maintenance personnel usually know these systems better than anyone." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat as Colonel Richards looked around the hangar. His gaze fell on her, and she saw him hesitate. She could almost read his thoughts. Should he really introduce a mechanic to this important visitor? "Martinez," he called out finally, "come over here." Sarah walked over on unsteady legs, acutely aware that she was probably the only enlisted person in a group of officers. Admiral Sullivan studied her with sharp, intelligent eyes. "You maintain this aircraft?" Sullivan asked. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, proud that her voice didn't shake. "Tell me about the avionics integration," Sullivan said. "How do the various systems communicate with each other?" For the next 10 minutes, Sarah found herself in the most detailed technical discussion of her career. Admiral Sullivan asked probing questions about electronic warfare systems, target acquisition, flight controls, and weapons integration. To Sarah's amazement, she found that she could answer every question, often in more detail than the Admiral seemed to expect. "Impressive," Sullivan said finally. "You clearly know these aircraft very well. How long have you been maintaining them?" 3 years, ma'am," Sarah replied. "And before that?" "I went through advanced avionics training at Fort Eustis, then specialized helicopter systems at Fort Rucker." Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. "Do you ever wish you could fly them?" The question caught Sarah completely off guard. For a moment, she considered giving the safe answer, the humble response that would keep her in her lane. But something in the Admiral's eyes told her that honesty might be valued more than diplomacy. "Every day, ma'am," Sarah said quietly. Admiral Sullivan smiled, the first time Sarah had seen her expression soften since her arrival. I thought you might say that. The demonstration flights went perfectly. Sarah watched from the ground as the Apache pilots showed off their aircraft's capabilities. Every system worked flawlessly. Every maneuver was executed with precision. Sarah felt a quiet pride knowing that her work had contributed to the success. But as the day wore on, she found herself thinking about her brief conversation with Admiral Sullivan. There had been something in the Admiral's expression, a look of understanding that suggested she saw more than just a mechanic in coveralls. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to wonder if there might be other possibilities out there. As the sun began to set over Fort Rucker, Sarah was back in the hangar, performing post-flight inspections on the aircraft that had been used in the demonstration. It was routine work, but she approached it with the same care she always did. These machines depended on her, and she would never let them down. She was deep in thought, checking the rotor head on one of the Apaches, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Admiral Sullivan approaching, alone for the first time all day. "Mind if I watch you work?" Sullivan asked. "Of course not, ma'am," Sarah replied, though her heart was racing again. For several minutes, Sullivan observed in silence as Sarah completed her inspection. Sarah tried to focus on her work, but she was acutely aware of being watched by one of the most important people in military aviation. "You move around that aircraft like you know it intimately," Sullivan observed finally. "I do know it, ma'am," Sarah said. "Every part, every system. I've studied these helicopters more than most people study anything in their lives." "Why?" The simple question hung in the air. Sarah paused in her work, considering how to answer. "Because I love them," she said finally. "I love how they work, how all the systems come together to create something that can fly. And because I know that pilots depend on my work. If I make a mistake, people die." Sullivan nodded slowly. "That's a heavy responsibility." "Yes, ma'am, but it's also an honor." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the quiet sounds of the hangar at evening. Other mechanics were finishing their work, preparing to head home or to the mess hall. But Sarah felt no urgency to leave. This conversation, whatever it was leading to, felt important. "Tell me something, Sergeant Martinez," Sullivan said finally. "If you could do anything in the Army, anything at all, what would it be?" Sarah looked at the Admiral, trying to read her expression. Was this a test? A trap? Or was it a genuine question from someone who might actually have the power to change things? "I'd be a pilot, ma'am," Sarah said. "I'd fly these aircraft instead of just fixing them." Admiral Sullivan smiled again. "I thought you might say that too." Sarah couldn't sleep that night. Admiral Sullivan's words kept echoing in her mind. The conversation had ended mysteriously, with the Admiral simply saying, "We'll see what we can do," before walking away. Sarah had no idea what that meant, but something in the Admiral's tone suggested it was more than just polite conversation. The next morning brought an unexpected summons. Sergeant Martinez was requested to report to Colonel Richards's office immediately. Sarah's stomach churned as she walked across the base. Had she said something wrong to Admiral Sullivan? Had she overstepped some boundary she didn't know existed? Colonel Richards looked uncomfortable when she entered his office. He was a good officer, fair and competent, but he clearly preferred dealing with situations that fit neatly into established categories. Sarah Martinez, with her combination of mechanical expertise and flying ambitions, didn't fit any category he knew how to handle. "Sit down, Martinez," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I had an interesting conversation with Admiral Sullivan before she left this morning." Sarah's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. "Yes, sir?" "It seems she was quite impressed with your knowledge of the Apache systems. She asked some very specific questions about your background and training." Sarah waited, not trusting herself to speak. She also asked about our pilot training programs, Richards continued. Specifically, whether we've ever considered cross-training experienced maintenance personnel. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Cross-training, pilot training. It was almost too much to hope for. Sir, Richards held up a hand. Let me finish. Admiral Sullivan made some suggestions about innovative approaches to personnel development. She believes the military isn't making full use of its human resources. Apparently, she's been pushing for pilot training programs that look beyond traditional candidates. Sarah's mouth felt dry. What does that mean for me, sir? Richards leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. It means you're about to get an opportunity that comes along maybe once in a career, if you want it. He pulled out a folder and opened it. There's a special evaluation program being set up at Rucker. It's designed to test whether experienced maintenance personnel can successfully transition to pilot training. You would be one of the first candidates. Sarah felt dizzy. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. I need to be clear about something, Richards continued. This isn't a guarantee. It's an evaluation. You'd have to prove yourself every step of the way. If you fail at any point, you go back to maintenance. And even if you succeed, there's no guarantee of assignment to Apache helicopters. You might end up flying transport or medical evacuation. I understand, sir, Sarah managed to say. Do you? Because this isn't just about you anymore. If this program works, it could open doors for other enlisted personnel who dream of becoming pilots. If it fails, those doors might stay closed for a very long time. That's a lot of pressure. Sarah thought about all the other mechanics she knew, all the talented people who had been told their dreams weren't practical. She thought about the young soldiers who would come after her, who might be looking for their own chance to fly. I want to try, sir, she said firmly. Richards nodded. I thought you might. Report to Flight Training Command tomorrow morning at 0700. Ask for Chief Warrant Officer Patricia Hayes. She'll be running your evaluation. That evening, Sarah called her mother for the first time in months. Maria Martinez was a practical woman who had worked 2 jobs to raise her daughter alone. She had always supported Sarah's decision to join the Army, but she had never quite understood her daughter's fascination with flying. Mija, are you sure about this? Her mother asked when Sarah explained the situation. You have a good job now, stable. Why risk it for something so uncertain? Because it's what I've always wanted, Mama, Sarah replied, and because I might not get another chance. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Your father wanted to fly too, she said finally. He used to talk about it all the time when you were little. Said he was going to save up for flying lessons. Sarah's father had died when she was 8, killed in an accident at the construction site where he worked. She had few memories of him, but she remembered him pointing at planes in the sky and talking about the freedom of flight. Maybe that's where you get it from, her mother said softly. Your stubborn dreams. The next morning, Sarah stood outside the Flight Training Command building at exactly 0700. She had barely slept, spending most of the night researching everything she could find about pilot training programs. She wore her cleanest uniform and had polished her boots until they gleamed. If she was going to fail, it wouldn't be for lack of effort. Chief Warrant Officer Patricia Hayes turned out to be a compact woman in her 40s with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had seen everything the Army could throw at her. She looked Sarah up and down with experienced eyes. So you're the mechanic who thinks she can fly, Hayes said. I'm the mechanic who knows she can fly, ma'am, Sarah replied. Hayes smiled slightly. We'll see about that. Follow me. The next several hours were unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Hayes put her through a battery of tests: physical fitness, psychological evaluation, spatial reasoning, mechanical aptitude. Sarah was relieved to discover that her years of maintaining aircraft had prepared her well for the technical aspects of the evaluation. Your mechanical knowledge is outstanding, Hayes said as they reviewed the test results. Better than most of the officers who come through here, and your spatial reasoning scores are in the top 5%. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet. Knowing how helicopters work and being able to fly them are two different things. Tomorrow we start practical evaluation. That practical evaluation began in a classroom where Sarah found herself studying alongside 3 other candidates, 2 junior officers fresh from college, and another enlisted soldier, a crew chief named Rodriguez from another unit. Sarah was the only woman and the oldest member of the group. The coursework was intense: flight theory, weather patterns, emergency procedures, federal aviation regulations. Sarah discovered that her years of studying aircraft systems gave her a significant advantage. While the other candidates struggled to understand how helicopter engines worked, Sarah was already thinking about advanced concepts like auto-rotation and vortex ring state. "Martinez," Hayes said after the first week of classes, "you're setting the curve pretty high for the others." "I don't want special treatment, ma'am," Sarah replied. "I just want to learn." "Good, because you won't get special treatment. If anything, people are going to expect you to fail. A lot of folks think this program is a waste of time and money. They're waiting for you to prove them right." The first time Sarah sat in the cockpit of a TH-67 training helicopter, she felt like she had come home. The controls fell naturally under her hands. The instrument layout made perfect sense. When the instructor, Captain Morrison, started the engine, Sarah felt the vibration through her body and knew exactly what was happening with each system. "Have you ever flown before?" Morrison asked as they went through the pre-flight checklist. "Only in simulators, sir," Sarah replied. Morrison looked skeptical. "Simulators are toys compared to the real thing. Don't get overconfident." But when they lifted off for Sarah's first actual flight, something magical happened. The helicopter responded to her inputs as if it were an extension of her own body. Morrison had planned to demonstrate basic hover techniques, but after 10 minutes he was letting Sarah control the aircraft herself. "This is unusual," Morrison muttered into his headset. "You sure you've never done this before?" "Never, sir," Sarah said, concentrating on maintaining a steady hover 3 feet above the ground. "Well, you're either a natural or you've been practicing somewhere I don't know about." The truth was somewhere in between. Sarah's homemade simulator had taught her the basics of helicopter control, but more importantly, her years of working on these machines had given her an intuitive understanding of how they behaved. She could feel when the engine was working harder than it should, could sense when the rotor disc was slightly out of balance. It was like having a conversation with an old friend. After 2 weeks of evaluation flights, Morrison pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "I've been instructing for 8 years," he said. "I've seen hundreds of student pilots come through this program. Some are naturals, some have to work hard for every skill they develop, but I've never seen anyone pick up helicopter flying as quickly as you have." "Thank you, sir." "Don't let it go to your head. You still have a long way to go before you're qualified to fly solo, much less in combat. But if you keep progressing at this rate, you're going to make some people very uncomfortable." Sarah knew what he meant. Word was getting around the base about the mechanic who was learning to fly. Some people were supportive, impressed by her quick progress. Others were resentful, convinced that she was getting special treatment or that the evaluation standards had been lowered to ensure her success. The hostility was most apparent in the officers' club, where student pilots traditionally gathered after training flights. Sarah wasn't technically welcome there as an enlisted soldier, but Captain Morrison had suggested she join the informal discussions about flying techniques and emergency procedures. The reception was chilly. "I don't see why they're wasting time and money on this experiment," Lieutenant Johnson said loudly enough for Sarah to hear. "We have perfectly good pilot candidates who actually belong in cockpits." "Maybe they're trying to prove a point about equal opportunity," another officer replied. "Politics and all that." Sarah kept her mouth shut and focused on her studies. She had learned long ago that proving herself through performance was more effective than arguing with people who had already made up their minds. But the constant undercurrent of resentment was exhausting. 3 weeks into the program, Sarah faced her first major setback. During a practice auto-rotation, simulating an engine failure, she made a critical error in judgment and nearly crashed the training helicopter. Morrison had to take control at the last second to prevent a serious accident. "What the hell happened up there?" Morrison demanded once they were safely on the ground. "I don't know, sir," Sarah said, shaken by how close they had come to disaster. "I thought I had enough altitude to complete the maneuver." Morrison studied the flight data for several minutes before speaking again. "You got overconfident. Started thinking like a mechanic instead of a pilot." "I don't understand, sir." "As a mechanic, you trust the machines completely. You know they'll work the way they're designed to work. But as a pilot, you have to assume that everything might fail at any moment. You have to have backup plans for your backup plans." That night, Sarah sat in her apartment, staring at her flight training manuals. For the first time since the program began, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she might not make it. Maybe Morrison was right. Maybe her mechanical background was actually a disadvantage, making her too trusting of complex systems that could fail without warning. She thought about the officers who were waiting for her to fail, who would see any mistake as proof that enlisted personnel didn't belong in cockpits. She thought about all the other mechanics who might never get a chance like this if she didn't succeed. The weight of expectation felt crushing, but then she remembered Admiral Sullivan's words. "We'll see what we can do." The Admiral had believed in Sarah's potential, had gone out of her way to create this opportunity. Sarah couldn't let her down. The next morning, she was back in the cockpit, more determined than ever. Morrison put her through the most challenging scenarios he could devise: multiple system failures, emergency landings in confined spaces, navigation in poor weather. Each time, Sarah approached the problems methodically, using both her mechanical knowledge and her growing pilot instincts to find solutions. "Better," Morrison said after a particularly difficult training session. "You're learning to think like a pilot while still using your maintenance background as an asset. That's a powerful combination." Word of Sarah's progress reached higher levels of command. One morning, she arrived at the flight line to find a group of senior officers observing her training session. Colonel Richards was there, along with several people she didn't recognize. The pressure was intense, knowing that her every move was being evaluated by people who could end her flying career with a single negative assessment. But Sarah had learned to channel pressure into focus. She flew the training mission flawlessly, demonstrating advanced techniques that some qualified pilots struggled with. When she shut down the helicopter after the flight, she saw several of the observers nodding approvingly. "Outstanding work, Martinez," Colonel Richards said as she completed her post-flight inspection. "You're making quite an impression." "Thank you, sir. I have some news for you. If you continue to progress at this rate, you'll be moving to the next phase of training ahead of schedule: advanced helicopter tactics and weapons systems." Sarah's heart leaped. Advanced training meant Apache helicopters, the aircraft she had dreamed of flying. It also meant that someone very high up in the chain of command was taking notice of her success. That evening, Sarah called her mother to share the news. "I'm proud of you, Mija," her mother said, "but be careful. The higher you climb, the farther you have to fall." It was good advice, but Sarah felt like she was flying now, not climbing. Every day brought new challenges, new skills to master, new boundaries to push. She was no longer just a mechanic who fixed helicopters. She was becoming a pilot who could fly them. But she was also becoming a symbol, whether she wanted to be or not. Her success or failure would influence military policy for years to come. Other enlisted personnel were watching her progress, hoping that she would prove it was possible to break through the barriers that had always kept them grounded. The pressure was enormous, but so was the opportunity. For the first time in her life, Sarah Martinez was exactly where she belonged. 2 days later, everything changed again. Sarah was in the middle of a challenging cross-country navigation exercise when her radio crackled to life. "Training Flight 7, return to base immediately," the tower controller said. "Priority traffic inbound." Morrison looked puzzled but complied, turning the helicopter back toward Fort Rucker. As they approached the airfield, Sarah could see an unusual amount of activity on the ground. Several black SUVs were parked near the flight line, and there seemed to be more security personnel than usual. "Looks like we have VIPs," Morrison observed. When they landed and shut down, Sarah saw a familiar figure walking toward their helicopter. Admiral Sullivan had returned to Fort Rucker, and she was headed straight for Sarah's aircraft. "Sergeant Martinez," the Admiral said as Sarah climbed out of the cockpit, "I understand you've been making remarkable progress." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, wondering why such a senior officer would make a special trip to check on one student pilot. "Good. Because I have a proposition for you. There's a special demonstration coming up, and I think you might be interested in participating." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. A demonstration meant flying in front of important people, possibly including other senior officers who could influence her future career. It also meant more pressure, more scrutiny, more opportunities for both success and failure. "What kind of demonstration, ma'am?" she asked. Admiral Sullivan smiled. "The kind that could change everything." Admiral Sullivan's proposition turned out to be both an incredible opportunity and a terrifying challenge. A joint military exercise was being planned at Fort Hood, Texas, involving Army, Navy, and Air Force units. High-ranking officials from the Pentagon would be observing, including the Secretary of Defense and several members of Congress. The exercise would showcase the latest in military aviation technology and tactics. Sarah would be given the chance to fly an Apache helicopter during the demonstration, but there was a catch. She would be flying alongside some of the military's most experienced combat pilots, and she would only have 6 weeks to prepare. Most pilots trained for months before being certified on the Apache. Sarah would have to compress that timeline dramatically. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah asked Admiral Sullivan when they met privately to discuss the details. "Because the military needs to evolve," Sullivan replied. "We're wasting talent by maintaining artificial barriers between different specialties. You're living proof that excellence can come from unexpected places." The Admiral paused, looking out the window at the aircraft parked on the flight line. "I was the first woman to command a carrier battle group," she continued. "Do you know how many people told me it couldn't be done? How many said women didn't belong on combat ships?" Sarah nodded. She had heard stories about the Admiral's groundbreaking career. "I succeeded because people were willing to give me a chance, even when conventional wisdom said I would fail. Now I'm in a position to give chances to others. But I need you to understand something. This isn't charity. I'm recommending you because I believe you're the best person for this mission." The weight of those words settled on Sarah's shoulders. The best person for the mission. Not the best available woman, or the best mechanic who wanted to fly, but simply the best. Training began immediately. Sarah was assigned to Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez, one of the Army's most experienced Apache instructors. Vasquez was known for her uncompromising standards and her ability to bring out the best in her students, even under impossible circumstances. 6 weeks, Vasquez said on their first day together. "Most pilots take 6 months to become proficient on this aircraft. You ready to work harder than you've ever worked in your life?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied. "Good, because we start with basic aircraft familiarization and we end with complex combat scenarios. There's no time for gradual learning curves or confidence-building exercises. You'll either keep up or you'll wash out." The Apache was unlike anything Sarah had trained on before. The TH-67 had been forgiving, almost gentle in its responses. The Apache was a predator, powerful and unforgiving. Every system was more complex, every procedure more critical. A mistake that might be embarrassing in a training helicopter could be fatal in an Apache. But Sarah had advantages that other students didn't possess. Her maintenance background meant she understood every system intuitively. When Vasquez explained how the targeting system interfaced with the weapon controls, Sarah could visualize the electronic pathways and mechanical linkages involved. When they discussed emergency procedures, Sarah knew exactly what was happening inside the aircraft during each step. "You learn fast," Vasquez observed after their first week of training. "Faster than anyone I've taught before." "It helps that I've been working on these aircraft for 3 years," Sarah replied. "It's more than that. You think like an Apache pilot. Aggressive but calculated, confident but not reckless. Some pilots never develop that mindset no matter how much training they get." The compliment meant everything to Sarah. Vasquez wasn't known for flattering her students, and her approval carried weight throughout the aviation community. As word spread about Sarah's rapid progress, the attention became intense. Military reporters began following her training, documenting her journey from mechanic to combat pilot. The story captured public imagination, the enlisted woman who dared to dream beyond her assigned role and was getting a chance to prove herself on the biggest stage possible. But with attention came scrutiny. Every flight was analyzed, every mistake magnified. Sarah found herself under a microscope, with critics ready to pounce on any sign that she wasn't ready for the responsibility she was being given. The criticism came to a head during a joint training exercise with Navy pilots. Sarah was practicing formation flying when one of the Navy aviators, Lieutenant Commander Blake Morrison, made several pointed comments over the radio about inexperienced pilots who didn't belong in combat aircraft. "Some people get opportunities they haven't earned," Morrison said during the debrief session, "and that puts everyone else at risk." Sarah felt her face burning with embarrassment and anger, but she forced herself to remain professional. She had learned that responding to provocation usually made situations worse, but Vasquez had no such restraint. "Commander Morrison," she said in a voice that could have cut steel, "Sergeant Martinez has demonstrated proficiency that most of your junior officers would envy. If you have specific concerns about safety or procedures, I'm happy to address them. But if you're just venting personal prejudices, you can do it somewhere else." Morrison backed down, but the damage was done. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the base, creating factions of support and opposition for Sarah's participation in the upcoming demonstration. Colonel Richards called Sarah into his office the next day. "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer," he said. "Are you having second thoughts about this demonstration?" "No, sir," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Because if you are, now's the time to speak up. Once we get to Fort Hood, there won't be any backing out. You'll be representing not just yourself, but this entire program." Sarah thought about her conversation with Admiral Sullivan, about all the people who had believed in her potential. She thought about the other mechanics and enlisted personnel who were watching her progress, hoping she would prove that excellence could come from anywhere. "I'm ready, sir," she said. Richards nodded. "I believe you are. But ready or not, you're about to face the biggest test of your military career." 3 weeks before the demonstration, Sarah received unexpected visitors. Her mother had flown in from Texas, along with her Aunt Carmen and her cousin Miguel, who had recently joined the Air Force. Seeing her family on the base felt surreal, as if 2 different worlds were colliding. "Mija, you look so serious in that flight suit," her mother said, hugging her tightly. "Like a real pilot." "I am a real pilot, Mama," Sarah replied, laughing. "Show us," Miguel challenged. "I want to see you fly one of those helicopters." Sarah arranged for her family to observe a training flight, watching from the control tower as she put the Apache through its paces. She flew complex maneuvers that demonstrated the aircraft's capabilities while showcasing her own growing skills. When she landed and shut down the helicopter, she could see the pride and amazement on their faces. "I never imagined," her mother said quietly. "When you were little and talked about flying, I thought it was just a dream. I never thought you would actually do it." That evening, they had dinner at a restaurant off base, talking about everything except helicopters and military demonstrations. For a few hours, Sarah was able to forget about the pressure and simply enjoy being with her family. But as the evening wound down, the reality of what lay ahead returned. "You scared?" Miguel asked as they walked back to the hotel. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Terrified," she admitted, "but excited too. This is what I've wanted my whole life." "Then you'll do great," her mother said firmly. "You've always been stubborn enough to succeed at anything you set your mind to." The final week of training was the most intense of Sarah's military career. Vasquez put her through every scenario imaginable. Multiple system failures, combat maneuvers in poor weather, coordinated attacks with other aircraft. Sarah's performance was flawless, but Vasquez kept pushing for perfection. "Good enough isn't good enough," Vasquez explained during one particularly grueling session. "When you're flying at Fort Hood, there will be cameras recording every movement, generals analyzing every decision. One mistake could end this program forever." Sarah understood the pressure, but she also felt a growing confidence in her abilities. The Apache had become an extension of herself, responding to her thoughts as much as her actions. She could feel the aircraft's moods, anticipate its reactions, push it to the limits of performance while maintaining absolute control. 2 days before departing for Fort Hood, Sarah had a final conversation with Admiral Sullivan. The Admiral had returned to observe Sarah's training and offer any last-minute guidance. "How do you feel?" Sullivan asked as they walked along the flight line. "Ready," Sarah said. "Nervous but ready." "Good. Nervous means you understand what's at stake. But don't let anxiety cloud your judgment. You've earned this opportunity through skill and dedication. Now you just need to trust yourself." They stopped beside an Apache helicopter, its sleek silhouette dark against the evening sky. Sarah had worked on dozens of these aircraft, had learned to fly them, had dreamed of taking one into combat. Now she was about to demonstrate her skills on the biggest stage possible. "There's something else I need to tell you," Admiral Sullivan said. "The Secretary of Defense has personally requested that you be part of this demonstration. Word of your progress has reached the highest levels of government." Sarah felt a moment of vertigo. The Secretary of Defense knew who she was. "Why?" she managed to ask. "Because your story matters. It represents the best of what our military can be, a place where talent is recognized and nurtured regardless of background or traditional expectations." The flight to Fort Hood took place on a brilliant, clear morning. Sarah flew her own Apache as part of a formation of 6 aircraft, each piloted by experienced combat veterans. As they approached the massive military installation, she could see the elaborate preparations that had been made for the demonstration. Grandstands had been erected, reviewing platforms built, security perimeters established. This was no routine training exercise. This was a showcase for the future of American military aviation, and Sarah was about to play a starring role. After landing and completing the required briefings, Sarah had a few hours to herself before the demonstration began. She walked around the base, trying to process everything that had happened over the past few months. 6 months ago, she had been just another mechanic, invisible to most of the pilots whose aircraft she maintained. Now she was about to fly in front of some of the most powerful people in government. The demonstration began at precisely 1400 hours. Sarah's role came midway through the program, after displays by F-22 fighters and Navy Blue Angels. She would be flying solo, performing a complex series of maneuvers that showcased the Apache's capabilities in electronic warfare, precision targeting, and close air support. As she walked to her aircraft, Sarah saw hundreds of faces in the grandstands, cameras recording every step, officials with binoculars focused on her movements. The pressure was enormous, but it was also energizing. This was her moment, her chance to prove that excellence could come from anywhere. She completed her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, checking every system, every control surface, every component that might affect the mission. When she climbed into the cockpit and started the engines, she felt the familiar surge of power and possibility that came with controlling such a magnificent machine. "Apache 77, you are cleared for demonstration profile," the tower controller announced. "Apache 77, Roger," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She lifted off smoothly, transitioning immediately into the first maneuver of her program. For the next 15 minutes, Sarah flew with a precision and artistry that left the observers speechless. She demonstrated low-level navigation through simulated enemy territory, coordinated attacks on multiple targets, evasive maneuvers that pushed the Apache to its performance limits. But the highlight of her demonstration was a complex scenario that combined all of these elements. Flying at near-ground level, she navigated through a series of obstacles, while simultaneously engaging simulated targets with remarkable accuracy. Her movements were fluid and aggressive, showcasing both the aircraft's capabilities and her own exceptional skill. When she finally landed and shut down the helicopter, the grandstands erupted in sustained applause. Sarah sat in the cockpit for a moment, hardly believing what she had just accomplished. She had flown perfectly, demonstrating skills that matched or exceeded those of pilots with years more experience. As she climbed out of the aircraft, she was immediately surrounded by reporters and officials. But the first person to reach her was Admiral Sullivan, wearing a smile that lit up her entire face. "Outstanding," the Admiral said, embracing Sarah warmly. "Absolutely outstanding." "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah replied, "for everything, for believing in me when no one else would." "I didn't create your talent, Sergeant Martinez. I just gave you a chance to show it." Later that evening, at the formal reception following the demonstration, Sarah found herself in conversations she could never have imagined. The Secretary of Defense personally congratulated her on her performance. Several generals discussed future opportunities for expanded training programs. Foreign military attachés wanted to know how the Army had developed such an innovative approach to pilot selection. But the conversation that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Chief Warrant Officer Davidson, the pilot who had dismissed her abilities back at Fort Rucker, approached her during a quiet moment. "I owe you an apology," he said simply. "I was wrong about you. Dead wrong." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "That means a lot. You've changed things, you know. There are mechanics on every base who are going to look at their careers differently because of what you've accomplished." As the evening wound down, Sarah stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The Texas sky was brilliant with stars, and she could hear the distant sound of aircraft taking off from the base. In a few days, she would return to Fort Rucker to complete her pilot training. After that, who knew where her career might lead? She thought about her father, who had dreamed of flying but never gotten the chance. She thought about all the people who had told her that mechanics should stick to fixing aircraft and leave the flying to others. She thought about Admiral Sullivan's faith in her potential, and about the mechanics and enlisted personnel who would follow in her path. Most of all, she thought about the Apache helicopter she had flown today, and how perfectly it had responded to her commands. She was no longer just a mechanic who understood how aircraft worked. She was a pilot who could make them soar. The next morning brought news that would define the rest of Sarah's career. Admiral Sullivan found her in the dining facility, where she was having breakfast with her fellow pilots. "Sergeant Martinez," the Admiral said, "I have an offer for you. How would you feel about becoming the Army's first enlisted Apache pilot instructor?" Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. "Ma'am?" We're establishing a new training program based on what we've learned from your success. We want experienced maintenance personnel who show aptitude for flying to have opportunities for pilot training. And we need instructors who understand both sides of aviation, the mechanical and the operational. It was more than Sarah had ever dared to hope for. Not just the chance to fly, but the opportunity to help others achieve their own dreams of flight. "I would be honored, ma'am," she said. "Good, because there are a lot of talented mechanics out there who deserve the same chance you got. And you're going to help make sure they get it." 6 months later, Sarah stood on the flight line at Fort Rucker, watching her first class of mechanic-to-pilot candidates complete their initial training flights. 5 enlisted personnel from different specialties, all of them recommended by their supervisors as having exceptional potential. 3 men and 2 women, representing the future of military aviation. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this point, from the mechanic bay where she had first dreamed of flying to the cockpit, where she had proven herself capable of achieving anything. It had been a difficult path, full of obstacles and skeptics, but it had led to something greater than personal success. As one of her students executed a perfect landing in the Apache helicopter, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond individual achievement. She was helping to break down barriers that had existed for decades, opening doors for talented people who had been told their dreams weren't practical. The radio crackled to life. "Instructor Martinez, student pilot completing post-flight inspection." "Roger that," Sarah replied. "Outstanding work today." She was no longer just a mechanic who had learned to fly. She was a pilot who was teaching others to soar. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she could hear Admiral Sullivan's words. Excellence can come from anywhere. Sarah Martinez had proven that truth, and now she was helping others discover it for themselves. The sky, it turned out, was big enough for everyone who dared to reach for it. Years later, when military historians wrote about the evolution of pilot training programs, they would mark Sarah's demonstration at Fort Hood as a turning point. The moment when the services began to recognize that talent could be found in unexpected places, and that the best pilots weren't always the ones who followed traditional paths to the cockpit. But Sarah would remember it differently. She would remember it as the day she finally became who she was always meant to be. Not just a mechanic and not just a pilot, but a person who proved that with enough determination and the right opportunities, anyone could learn to fly.